Hello and welcome back to my little foundry. While heat treating the dagger that I made recently, I noticed this thing lying around in the foundry. It's been here ages. I can't remember where it came from, but it is good and thick. Now, when I made the dagger, I was actually trying to make a spearhead. The shaft from which I made the dagger was 13mm thick. This is about 20, it's more than 3/4 of an inch. So, might this give me a spearhead? Or, if I manage to keep it straight enough, all the way along its length, could I try and make a sword out of it? Clearly whoever made this wanted to use it as some sort of crank, because they've ground a square tip onto this thing. That's going to be useful to me to grip the bar with my mole grips while I'm working on it. So all I really need to do is to cut off this bit here. As you can see, I have had a go at this already, but I was using the knifemaker's forged I used to make my dagger, and it just couldn't get enough heat into this enormous piece of rebar. So what I'm planning to do is to improvise and use my furnace as an impromptu forge. I'm tending to find that the furnace is only heating that part of the rebar which is buried in charcoal. I've experimented by absolutely filling the furnace with charcoal, which is now burning away. Any second now I'm going to withdraw the piece of rebar and see if it's worked, because if not I'm going to have to rethink this, because I can't just forge out the tip of the thing. I want to forge it out all the way along. I thought that everything inside the furnace would become red hot, but that's simply not happening, only that which is buried in charcoal. So let's see what we've got now. Yeah. To be honest, I'm glad that we're running out of charcoal, as I've noticed that my blows are becoming more and more feeble, and I'm finding it harder to control the work. let's try again. Disaster has struck. On the first heat of day 2, I left it in the furnace for too long and lost a good bit from the end. I should say this much, maybe 3 inches or about 75 millimeters from the end. I'm absolutely heartbroken. I'm going to have to be more careful in future. Surely this has got to get it hot. At last we've got the middle bit glowing. This is the way to do it then. This is how I'll carry on. Back on the furnace. So that is what I've achieved by the end of day 2 in terms of flattening it out. I'm just going to try and straighten it up a little bit and we'll call it a day. The furnace has had enough for one day, and to be frank, so have I. It's the beginning of day 3 and I'm beginning to worry that I've been subjecting you guys to too much footage of me forging. So today I'm just going to film the difference between how the thing looked when I started, which you've just seen, and how it looks at the end of today, so you don't have to sit through lots of sped up footage of me whacking a thing with a hammer. This is probably the last or second to last heat of day 3 as I'm running out of charcoal again. But we've got the thing more or less consistent in thickness, except here where it's a bit too thick. There's a thick bit here, and there's a thick bit here. The furnace has gone to sleep, and this is how far we've come. There's an old English expression. We say that someone's been going at it hammer and tongs all day. Well, having just spent 3 days hitting this bit of metal with a hammer, I can start to appreciate all the work that used to go into every single hand-forged metal piece or component of anything up until the modern era. As you'll have seen in the forging footage, a lot of effort has to go into keeping it straight, both in this plane and in this plane. I hope I haven't done too badly for a second timer. I've finished the forging. This end will be the hilt, and as you can see the blade's very thick at this end, and I've tried to achieve a taper towards the tip. In this plane this is called a distal taper, and I've got the opposite of the correct profile taper because it's wide at the end where it's thin and it's narrow at the end where it's thick. So the next thing I have to do is take a grinder to it and get the right profile taper. I'll start by cutting the nasty ends off where I screwed up. This end's pretty horrible, the tip, and at the thick end there are some nasty pits. The next thing I'm going to do is cut off the horrible wobbly edges, so I've got a parallel edged piece of steel to work with. I've done my best to straighten it up a little by skimming the edges here, for example. It hasn't always worked very well. On this side I had to abandon the cut because the blade is very flexible, the disc is very flexible, and the cut began to wander, so I abandoned it. I think it's time for me to cut a point onto this thing and then go over to the grinding disc. Here's the beginnings of a point. I had some more wandering wheel trouble here, so I've given up on my floppy cutting disc and I'm going to go over to the grinding disc. So I've started putting a basic bevel on the thing, having come to realise that the thinner the edges, the less material I shall have to remove when I come to straighten up the blade. I've removed quite a lot with the big grinder. The tang is now much thinner, and if I take you on a tour of the blade, here the edge is still very thick. That's where I cut it off because it bulged out to one side. And if we flip it over, marks like this are actually the remnants of the dips left by the rebar, and it's quite interesting because they've stretched out much further apart than they are on the original piece. So I was right in thinking that I was also making this longer as I forged it flat. Sadly I burnt the two ends off, so I lost the benefit, but we can tell it did get longer because these marks, which are going to have to come off obviously, are so far apart now. This last one could constitute a bit of a weak spot. I need to go through with the small grinder now and get rid of these little dips. Here's the first one. One thing I like to do is to keep the blade reasonably cool by cooling it off periodically in my teacup here. You saw me drinking tea from this cup earlier on in the video while we were forging. I wouldn't like you to think that I only own one cup. I do actually own another, but I lent it to two girls years ago and I don't want it back. I have successfully got rid of the nasty dips all the way along the blade, but at a cost. I've now got very fat, thick edges, and I need to make a decision rather soon about what sort of blade cross-section I would like. See there where it's really thick because I had to go a long way to get rid of these. As for blade cross-section, I think there are pretty much three choices. I could go for a sort of rhombus, like my dagger, which I did like. I could go for a flattened hexagon, or this, which is called lenticular. I rather like lenticular. I don't know which would be easiest to do. I think probably the biface would be easiest to get even. I suppose I should decide before I carry on. After some thought over a cup of tea, I decided to go for the lenticular cross-section because I've already done the rhombus-shaped biface and I didn't like the flattened hexagon one. It looked somehow lazy and half-finished. So I wanted to do something I hadn't done before, and I've gone for the curved lenticular one. I've started on it with a small grinder. I'm using a traditional hard disc rather than a flat wheel to try and keep everything even in this plane as I go along, and I'm just going round like that. It will, I suspect, take rather a long time, and I'm not going to ask you to sit through loads and loads of sped up footage of me grinding away at this blade this time. Several hours have passed since I last pressed record, and the blade now looks like this. It's starting to be recognisable as an attempt at a sword blade. That's it for the small grinder with the flat wheel. I'm going to go over to a file. Further progress. Still a lot more to do. I found that holding the sanding machine soon gave me white finger, so I'm taking a leaf out of the book of Jeff from the metal casting channel Veg Oil Guy. I recently saw him do a much better job of mounting a palm sander upside down, and so I'm going to give this a try. I've taken the blade up to 240 grit on that cheap sander. Sadly, the sander began to stink of very hot electronics. So at 240 grit I'm calling it a day for the blade. And now I'd like to introduce you to the crossguard. I cut this from a length that was leaning up against the wall in my garage and has been for some time. That's where I propose to penetrate it to accept the sword blade. As for the pommel, I intend to cut it from this stuff. This is about 1 inch or 25 mil, excluding the extra width of the protrusions. Once I've ground the protrusions off, I should be left with a piece of round bar about 1 inch thick. So that's what I've cut off. Now to grind it to shape.
this is what I'm left with once I've ground off the worst of the bulges from the sides. That's still horrible. I don't even know what shape pommel I'm going for yet. We'll see. This is what we're left with. I've rounded over one end, the end which had been cut with a giant pair of hydraulic snips. It was all bulged out to one side. And when I measure this, I'm getting variously 24 and 25 millimeters for the diameter, according to quite where I measure it. So it's an inch. Not sure if I've mentioned the fact that I've welded a small length of threaded bar into the tip of the tang. The reason for this is not because I propose to thread on the pommel, but just because threaded bar is better than round bar at gripping epoxy. So here's a centre punched mark where I propose to drill the base of the pommel to accept this with some epoxy. So the pommel fits on the end. Here's the pommel. I've made it as evenly shaped as I can, hand holding it and rubbing it against a 7-inch flat wheel on a 9-inch grinder. I'm using a flat wheel because they're less finger lethal than the hard carborundum discs. When inevitably you make a mistake, get tired and let a finger brush against the disc. This just leaves a nice cauterized wound that heals quickly. I've polished the pommel up on the yellow bench grinder that we saw earlier. The yellow bench grinder doesn't like sword making. It's begun to smell very strange, but it's still working, and it did this, so I'm grateful to it. Here we get our first glimpse of how the finished sword might look. Here's the crossguard. I've drilled 3 holes right through it, and now I'm going to pop it in the forge, get it red hot, put it on the anvil and see if I can't join up those 3 holes. I didn't get the footage, but basically I just heated it up till it was red hot and hammered straight through, as you can see here. Now I've got to tidy this up. After bashing through the hot crossguard on the anvil, I attacked it with files and I've ended up with this. It's not particularly pretty, but for the first time the crossguard slides down into its position. I've been using a small grinder to carve a crude shape into the crossguard, so it's not just a straight bar. Here it is after a little more work. You can sort of start to see what overall shape I'm aiming for. 15 minutes later, after 10 minutes on the yellow bench sander, it's got a bit of a luster to it. I've reached a point at which the crossguard feels really silky smooth to the touch. It's still pretty scratched up, as you can see, but the yellow bench sander doesn't like working for too long at once. It starts to smell, and I've just stopped because it was smelling. Maybe while it cools down I'll start to think about the wood for the side scales of the hand grip. I've cut the end off a piece of wood which last did duty as a set wall in a radio control car video. When I chopped the end off I could see that this is quite an attractive piece of hardwood, so I'm going to use this to make my side scales. I've cut the block down and split it in 2 rather crudely. You can see where the grinder came into play, and now all I have to do is peel off my brickwork, because these are going to be the insides of the handles, these good faces, so they'll mate up nicely, and the 2 horrible faces will be sanded away and form the outside of the grips. And now I need to hollow them out to accommodate the tang. I've probably done them a bit deeper than I needed to get them to clear the tang, but it doesn't matter because I need to trim this down, as my plan of using the two factory flat surfaces because they would mate perfectly together hasn't worked out. And now we're getting closer. There's a problem. I don't like the way these wooden side grips look. They're too chubby. I might have to rethink this. Perhaps this round section softwood dowel would be more suitable. That looks better to me. I prefer these proportions. It's time to heat treat the blade. The difficulty will be getting this blade to the right temperature all the way along its length at once. So to try and overcome that, I'm fiddling around with some bricks, trying to create a sort of heat chamber so that the blade will stay warmer for longer as I move it in and out. Here's the arrangement I came up with. Let's see what effect it has in terms of keeping the blade warm. The blade could shatter when I do this because I'm using water rather than warm canola oil, which seems to be the internet's favourite. I'm hoping that the low carbon content will save me. If I move the blade slowly in and out, I can get the whole thing to glow red hot all at once, but it's not the kind of red I'm looking for. I don't think I'm getting the blade hot enough. Let's try and see whether this works. It didn't shatter, but I suspect that it didn't harden much either. The next thing for me to do, now that this blade doesn't need to ever get hot again, is to fix the crossguard in position, and I'm going to do that using 2-part epoxy. However, I'm not going to be doing it on camera. That went well, so while I'm on a roll, I'm going to go ahead and glue my new side scales to the tang. The gaps at the sides where you can see the tang are actually very shallow, as you see here, so the plan is to fill them once this epoxy's gone off. Now that the epoxy's gone off, I can trim these down. Here they are, filled with firework rocket sticks and trimmed back. I even gave the handle a kiss with the yellow bench sander. Though in fact I troubled the machine unnecessarily because I afterwards remembered that I still needed to fare these in so that they line up with the very uneven crossguard on either side. Now to think about how to make the pommel look more integrated with the wood when I add it to the top. I've trimmed away the top of the wood to a circle with a 17mm circumference, the same as that of the pommel. So I can glue that on and think about a finish for the handle. I used one of my trusty sandpaper and popsicle stick homemade nail file things to round the wood up a bit such that it coincides with the pommel. You can see I've been pretty generous with the filler as well. What I'm going to do next is give this a coat of black acrylic. Here's the handle with the paint dry. Right, well we'd better test it. What can I stab? Avast, varlet! Have at thee! Oh, seems to work quite well. Perhaps it is a sword. Well, if ever I'm attacked by a 1-litre water bottle, I shall know exactly how to dispatch it with my trusty rebar sword. Thanks for watching.